Welcome to the Uniting America podcast, presented to you by braverangels. I'm braverangels National Ambassador and your host, JohnWoodJr. This is your doorway into the movement to save the Republic, the movement to realize the dream of Martin Luther King. Join us. This is the movement to build a house united. The mainstream ideologies of the American left and right, I would argue, are shifting. As a kid in the 90s and a teenage activist in the early 2000s, I can remember left and right in this country generally defined by commitments to greater regulation and a stronger social safety net on the one hand, and by lower taxes and a freer economy on the other. Many look back on the 90s as the heyday of, quote, neoliberalism, and the dominance of a Clinton-led Democratic Party establishment that was comfortably enmeshed with corporate power. With the invasion of Iraq in the early 2000s, there was added to this an anti-war movement on the left versus a resurgent so-called neoconservatism on the right that sought to advance liberty abroad through military intervention and nation-building, the politics of Dick Cheney and George W. Bush. The Obama Tea Party years, of course, would greatly sharpen our cultural divisions. From 2008 to 2016, polarization hit new depths, with many feeling that identity politics were on the rise. But in my estimation, it was with the Trump and now Biden era that we have come to see a left and right divide in our country in which the traditional domestic and foreign policy arguments, while they still remain highly relevant, of course, have increasingly given way a bit to a different issue set entirely. We now stand in the era of the culture wars, where the arguments are less over taxes and regulation and increasingly more over how we ought to overhaul the structures of a, let's say, patriarchal white supremacist society versus how we root out the reverse racism and gender relativism of a leftism bent on destroying everything good about America. This is how I see the sides as coming to see themselves, or rather to see each other. It is in this context that I find myself speaking to Yoram Hazony. Hazony is an Israeli-American scholar and philosopher who is a foremost thinker in the national conservatism movement. He is controversial, without question, with many believing that he represents a shift in conservative thinking that veers away from fundamental tenets of long-standing mainstream liberal and conservative assumptions in America. And, as you will hear in our conversation, those critics are not necessarily wrong. This sometimes also bleeds into a description of Hazony and others in the national conservatism sphere, which likens their philosophy to that of the right-wing nationalists like Richard Spencer and others who wish to see the USA become, in essence, a white ethno-state. Now, in Hazony's case, at least, I would like to say that this seems to be quite wrong, but you will hear what he has to say about it. I wanted to get to know Yoram Hazony. I wanted to hear his arguments from his own mouth and get a clear sense of the essentials of his philosophy. I do press him to respond to certain historical and philosophical points of my own, but this is a philosopher's conversation about how we ought to be thinking about America in terms of her relationship to pluralism, religion, and how we really ought to understand the teachings of the Founding Fathers. In some sense, Hazony represents a new right in America that parallels the rise of a new left that, while they are bitterly opposed to each other, do share some common ground in their aversion to certain assumptions that were all but taken for granted as default commitments of mainstream liberalism and conservatism not many years ago. You'll hear Yoram acknowledge some of that in our talk. I enjoyed this conversation and think that you will too. And now, Yoram Hazony. Yoram Hazony, welcome to Uniting America, my friend. How are you?
Very good. Pleasure to be there with you in Los Angeles, or the next closest thing by Zoom.
There you go. Well, from Jerusalem to LA, it is great to make this connection. And just really gratifying to get the opportunity to speak to somebody directly who so many people have so many things to say about, Mr. Hazony.
That was very nicely put. Yes.
Well, it is on some level, it is a compliment, regardless of what connotations or implications may seem to be loaded into it, because just being impactful says, I think, a little something about the fact that you're wrestling with extremely important issues. and making arguments that, whether they're resonating with people or triggering people, are clearly pointing us in directions where, we need to be engaging our mental energies. And so I wanted to have something of a philosophical conversation with you. I want to understand, sort of cut through the muck of what people say about you to understand, who you actually are and what you actually believe. And so I do have a bit of a simple a simple opening question that might help us to accomplish this a little bit to start off. You are somebody who people closely associate with the term nationalism. What is your definition of nationalism, and is it what is meant by others when they embrace the phrase blood and soil nationalism? What is the difference between what you represent and what other people may mean by that term, if anything?
Okay, well, in 2018, I published a book called The Virtue of Nationalism. And for anybody who's interested in the sort of in the long playing version of the argument with all the footnotes and the historical references, you can go to the book. But as you're asking me for the simple version, so the simple version is that in most times and places, the word nationalism is historically referred to a principled, political theory that sees the world as governed best when many nations are independent, when they have national freedom to chart their own course on the basis of their own traditions and their own interests. And this term nationalism has sort of reappeared on the scene in a big way in after 2016, after the Brexit, the vote for British independence called Brexit, and then after that the Trump movement and the Trump administration. So at this point, I think nationalist conservatives, this idea of nationalist conservatism has become much stronger over these years. And in addition to President Trump, Ron DeSantis is for sure roughly of this kind of worldview. And we have Giorgia Meloni, who is now the prime minister in Italy, and she has very similar views on lots of things. So the bottom line is what these very different politicians have in common is that all of them are pushing to move away from the New World Order of George H.W. Bush, this theory. Sometimes it's called globalism, but I think we could call it liberal internationalism. The theory that the best kind of order for the world would be if there's a single rule of law that kind of wraps the whole globe or as many countries as possible, and that was kind of a dominant political theory in from the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, 1990 through 2016. So there really was an entire generation where both Republicans and Democrats and most of the major political parties in Britain and in Europe all supported this idea of taking down the borders and allowing free flow of goods and services and populations to move around. It was kind of like this utopian dream. It didn't work out so well, and now we have a conservative nationalist resistance in most Western countries. And it's won elections in some places. I think an awful lot of people, if they get into the subject, they'll find that it's not as far away from the things they believe as they might think.
Indeed. Well, the second part of the question is that distinct from what people mean when they use the phrase sort of blood and soil nationalism? And my understanding of that second phrase is that it is tied to sort of, centering sort of, ethnic or kind of racial sovereignty over a piece of land. And of course, in the United States of America, we can associate that with various, movements who, sort of believe that, they have something of a racial claim to, a general sort of hegemony in American life. But the reason I bring that up is simply because I think for people looking at this conversation way from the outside, right, there's just a tendency to lump all of these things, together under a similar term, right? And so you think, well, conservative nationalism, oh, that sounds like, most conservatives are white, kind of sounds like white nationalism and so forth. So I'm inviting you, to address that association if you care to do so.
Right. Sure. Okay. Well, look, the expression "blood and soil" it comes from Germany, from 19th century German politics, and as I wrote in the book, the Germans have a very, very peculiar place in the discussion of nationalism, because if we're thinking about a world of independent nations, this is an idea that goes all the way back to the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and it appears usually as kind of a counterbalance against the Roman political inheritance, which basically is about conquering the whole world and bringing peace and prosperity by imposing a single imperial rule. And so there are certain peoples that have, over the centuries, that have adopted this biblical Hebraic inheritance, and so they believe in a world of independent nations as kind of like the main thread of their political tradition, and that includes Western European countries like the Dutch, the French, the English, the Scots, and later the Americans. I'm not saying that that any of these peoples was free of imperialism, but the strain of a world of independent nations is always very, very strong in those places. But by the way, in Eastern Europe also, among the Poles and the Hungarians and other peoples, you also find this. Where you don't find it so much is among the Germans, because the Germans were the strongest people in Europe, and for many centuries had sort of this dream of reestablishing the Roman Empire. Your listeners have probably heard of the Holy Roman Empire. So the Holy Roman Empire is a kind of a medieval German attempt to reestablish the universal Roman Empire. Right. Sometimes it's called the Holy Roman Empire of the Germanies, and so the Germans have this inheritance of an idea that Germany shouldn't be just an independent state like all others, but rather has a role of kind of uniting all of Europe, and beyond that, maybe the whole world. So there's different versions of this, but of course the most famous, the most hideous version is the Nazi version, and sure enough, when Hitler talks about the Third Reich, he's talking, for him, the First Reich is the Holy Roman Empire, and so he, what he calls nationalism is something that people from any of these other countries would usually call biological imperialism. I mean, what does he write in Mein Kampf? Not that I recommend people read it, but I have read it, and when Hitler talks about nationalism, he doesn't mean what we mean by nationalism. He means that Germany should, and this is explicit, should be the lord of the earth, or the mistress of the globe. These are expressions that he uses directly. And so since I'm not particularly interested in learning political theory from Hitler, I prefer to use the traditional biblical understanding of this term, which is a world in which different nations will have independence, and they'll allow others to be independent rather than seeking to dominate all.
Right. So yours is not a philosophy of domination. It is a philosophy of sovereignty and nationhood. And so I think my instinct from there is to ask you then, where does your perspective find tension, if it does, with sort of the traditional liberal conception of America as the United States of America as a civic and democratic project? You were preceded on this podcast by my friend, the young Coleman Hughes. I don't know if you're familiar with Coleman.
Sure.
Yes, Coleman.
Well, I haven't met him, but I've seen him. He talks real good.
Well, I look forward to you two having.
I like him.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to the two of you having the chance to have a conversation at some point. But we were covering some adjacent territory, and we were just talking about the nature of the United States as an experiment. And Coleman said to me the other day, as many others have said, that the United States of America is distinct because whereas other nations are founded upon a shared ethnic identity, the United States of America proceeds from an idea. And so, we can make reference to sort of the Jeffersonian language in the Declaration that, all men are created equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights. But this idea that as an experiment in democracy, not to quibble with terms like democracy versus constitutional republic, et cetera, but that this is a country that derives its essential identity from the fact that we are free peoples with equal standing who have the right to speak freely, that we engage in processes of reason filtered up through representative government that channel, however imperfectly, sort of a collective will, and that in so doing, we are able to affect a culture and a program of self-government, which doesn't necessarily require us to share universal bonds of shared tradition, be they religious or otherwise, even if those things sort of, inform the character of individuals and individual groups of Americans within that larger sort of civic framework. And so, I look at that as sort of, kind of the liberal appreciation of the nature of the American project. I think it's just sort of taken as common wisdom that that's what America, is and rightfully ought to be. But I do get the sense that some folks, certainly within the conservative nationalist sort of, umbrella, take a different view or are critical of that in some way. So I would love to know from you sort of, if you find some tension within yourself towards that description of America, and if so, where that might be.
Well, look, I've never been a liberal.
Mm-hmm.
I've been a conservative, since I was a kid learning about politics from my father. So
just very quickly, you would therefore reject the idea that the conservatives, that sort of, the conservatives are the true liberals today, right? Because that's a common formulation that you hear sometimes. That
it's a common formulation among liberals, but
right.
it's rejected by conservatives. It depends who you're talking about.
Right.
So sorry about the self-promotion, but again,
no, please.
I wrote a book called Conservatism: A Rediscovery, which was published last year by Regnery, and again, I'll try to give you the quick version, but people want to see the argument in detail and in depth with all the appropriate footnotes. Please take a look at the book. So let's begin just, I think, by really quickly distinguishing, like, what am I talking about when I distinguish between liberalism and conservatism? So liberalism is it's a family of views that begin politics with the freedom of the individual. The individual is born perfectly free. The individual is born perfectly equal, or at least becomes so by the time he or she reaches the age of reason. Let's say at the age of 20 or 18 or something like that. And liberals in general historically have also thought that political and moral obligation is you take it upon yourself by choice.
Yeah.
That in some way, the right way to do politics is only to obligate people when they agree to be obligated, and that makes it a philosophy that is very, very, very focused on the freedom of the individual. Conservatism is somewhat of a different story. First of all, liberalism is a universal theory, and liberals generally claim that it applies in all times and places. That it's sort of like objectively true. Conservatism is a different story because it begins with the observation that there are many different nations, many different tribes, many different religions in the world, many ways to construct a family, and so conservatives, I think, are a lot more skeptical about the idea that there's obvious universal truths that apply everywhere, even though our conservative tradition is very biblical, and so it certainly does recognize universal truths. But conservatives are very skeptical about human beings using our reason, being able to get to the truth that applies to everybody. The main thread of conservative thought is a view that asks the following question: I'm born into a certain family, into a certain tribe or community, into a certain nation, family of nations, religion. And, of course, people, some people do during their lives leave their nation and join another. But the question is, if you're going to stay in the nation in which you were born, which most people do, what are your obligations to that nation? Do you have obligations to uphold the laws? Do you have obligations to uphold the customs and to give honor to the beliefs of the people among whom you grew up? The same kind of question with families. Do you have obligations when you're born into a family? I mean, you'll notice that there's virtually no choice about this in conservative thought. Honor your father, your mother. Well, you didn't choose your parents. You don't choose the biblical obligation to honor them. You're born into that obligation, and the same is true for your nation. That if your nation is attacked, a conservative will say, "There's no choice in this matter. You, as a result of the fact that you grew up among this people, if your family and your people are under attack and under threat, you have an obligation to try to help them." And so conservatives are much more interested in what have we inherited from the past. How do we distinguish the good parts from sometimes the evil parts that have been inherited? But what's good about what we've inherited, and how do we strengthen it going forward? How do we make sure that the community that we're born into is better off for our grandchildren than it was for our grandparents? And this argument between liberals and universal reason on the one hand, and conservatives who are much more traditional, this argument splits the American founding down the middle. I mean, you correctly quoted Jefferson. Jefferson and Paine are the the most explicitly and vehemently liberal of the American founders, but the liberals didn't write the American Constitution. Jefferson did write the Declaration of Independence, but the American Constitution was written by the Conservative Party, which later is called the Federalists. And if you read what the leading Federalists, Washington, John Jay, Hamilton, Adams, Governor Morris, who is the principal author of the American Constitution, what did these much more conservative American founders, how did they look at things? Well, I think I think that they all would agree that the American experiment includes an openness to toleration and diversity of different kinds of ways of life. All of that is agreed to, but the foundation that you're describing is not agreed to. John Jay in Federalist 2 describes America as a people, a people that is bound together by bonds of similar religion, similar national background, similar laws and traditions, similar language. In other words, all the things that liberals like to say, "Oh no, America's not that." If you actually start looking at the party that came up with the American Constitution and the reasons that it came up with this Constitution, you'll find that it's very, very, very similar to the way that that the English think about their nation, or the Scots, or the French. These are, or the Dutch. John Jay himself had a Dutch heritage, so there's a strong Dutch influence there. So I think there's an argument about what the American experiment is and what's good for it. And liberals and conservatives are not. We're very often not on the same side.
And so, just to push just a little bit further on
Please.
that, James Madison, of course, was a Democratic Republican and a principal ally of Thomas Jefferson's. Certainly, I think during the later years, but he also was a very important voice in the drafting of the Constitution, particularly the Bill of Rights, of course, and the first 10 amendments. Now, perhaps he was responding in part to pressure from Patrick Henry and others to more sort of directly identify the liberties of individuals. But nevertheless, is it not the case that there's a clear commitment to individual rights, which perhaps we can see as sort of an expression of some Enlightenment heritage in the Constitution? Your points about sort of the conservative influence on the Constitution notwithstanding.
Well, look, I think that the problem with talking about Enlightenment influence is that it ignores the inheritance that Americans had from England. This is a famous argument between Jefferson's party and Washington's party over whether the French Revolution is basically the same thing that did happen and should happen in America, or whether the American Revolution actually is more about adapting the traditional English and British Constitution to conditions in the United States. That's a theoretical argument that divided those two parties. By the way, Madison himself is an interesting character because he was a Jeffersonian loyalist until Jefferson goes to France, and as soon as Jefferson goes to France, he's there for 5 years. Madison swings over to being an ally of John Jay and Hamilton and Washington, working very closely with Washington. And then as soon as Jefferson is back, Madison swings back to Jefferson.
It's the Jeffersonian center of gravity, which kind of
yeah, right. So he's kind of like a planet orbiting either Washington or Jefferson. But as you mentioned, later in life, Madison starts to go back again. So he's a complicated character, and I think you can find all sorts of things in Madison in general. He's much more pragmatic than Jefferson was. But to go back to the this Enlightenment issue, what I did in Conservatism: A Rediscovery, I opened the book by tracing the history of the ideas that we're used to calling, Enlightenment rationalist political ideas, and I take the parts of the English common law tradition. I begin with a famous common lawyer and political theorist named John Fortescue. At the end of the 1400s, now we're talking about the end of the Middle Ages, he writes a short book called In Praise of the Laws of England. And every one of the American founders knew In Praise of the Laws of England. And what you can get, there's an inexpensive Cambridge version. You can read it. The English has been, the spelling's corrected, so you can easily read it. And when you open it, the first thing that you see is that in the 1470s or 1480s, John Fortescue is talking about the separation of powers and the bicameral legislature and taxation and legislation as being the prerogatives of the legislature in order to balance the executive, and he goes on and on into this. The jury trial is one of his major themes. Why is England freer than any nation in Europe? And a lot of it, he says, is because of the jury trial, but in part he says it's because of our traditional legal concern for private property, the fact that our king is not allowed to enter the home of any farmer without the farmer's permission, much less to expropriate things. So he directly connects English liberties to the common law inheritance, but especially the protections of private property. And look, we could just go on and on.
Right.
The American Conservative Party was well aware that these are the inherited forms of the English, and at the same time, they also knew that America is different. America has no king. America has no aristocracy. It never did, and so a large part of what's happening is that over 150 years, the Americans, while embracing the English common law, they applied it in New England and in the central states and in the southern states in different ways and adapted it to the different conditions, so that what they are thinking of when they write the Constitution is they're thinking both about the traditional English Constitution, but also about the way that it had been adapted to American conditions over 150 years. But they see themselves as traditionalists. And now if you ask about Madison's Bill of Rights, that Bill of Rights, if you dig into Patrick Henry, you'll see that he thinks that those are the rights of Englishmen. Sure. The rights in the Bill of Rights, they're in the Petition of Right that was written by John Selden, and they're in the English Bill of Rights 100 years before they're in the American Bill of Rights. So you can claim, like Jefferson does, that we're exercising universal reason, and anybody could come up with this if he just thought about it, but it isn't actually true.
Well, and I promise that this is the last question in this direction.
No, you can ask as many questions as you want.
And this one is an admittedly unfair question, but I just want to throw it at you for you to play with just very quickly. Was the Revolutionary War a conservative act? Therefore,
this is an.
I mean, it's an unfair question, but there's a point to it. Yeah.
No, it's one of those old chestnuts that just people argue about this endlessly, and we're not going to settle it here today. But the conservative view of it is that the American Revolution was similar to the Glorious Revolution in England, in that the people doing it believed that what they were doing was not, out of, pure universal reason coming up with the true Constitution. The people doing it thought that they were restoring the previous Constitution that had been abrogated.
Right.
And even Jefferson, I mean, in the Declaration of Independence, other than 2 or 3 lines, most of it is in those terms, saying, look, we know what rights we've inherited, but the problem is that those traditional rights of Englishmen are being abrogated by the King of England.
Mm.
And I would take that actually seriously, because if you look at certain experiments during the American Revolution, experiments in like inventing a wholly new constitution on the basis of reason, there were such experiments. The Constitution of Pennsylvania from 1777, and other constitutional experiments in Georgia and in Vermont. And you could also say the Articles of the Confederation. These are all documents that were based on reasoning completely from scratch and inventing a new constitution.
Right.
And they look, in a lot of ways, they look like the French Revolution. And what happens is that the chaos and violence, especially in Pennsylvania under the Revolutionary Constitution, is so frightening and so it's really almost like a trial run for what happens in France later on, just a few years later. And the Conservative Party comes together to create the American Constitution in significant degree because of what they believed was the chaos and the violence that came of trying to come up with an Enlightenment constitution on the basis of pure reason. And Washington is very clear in this. He's all through the war, but certainly by the middle of the War of Independence, he thinks he's writing circular letters to anyone who listen, saying we need a constitution like the one in England. And nothing short of that is going to be able to save this country.
Indeed, I find a fair amount to sympathize with you about with respect to your analysis here. Let me ask you a different question, and let me set it up in this way. I not too long ago, I don't know if you had a chance to look at it, but I gave a speech to the Acton Institute, sort of identifying what I felt to be sort of the what some folks might consider to be sort of the unlikely convergence of first principles that I at least identify as existing between Martin Luther King Jr. and Russell Kirk, individuals who you can look at as essentially having sort of seeded both the sort of the nonviolent civil rights movement, of course, and the conservative movement, both coming out of the sort of mid 20th century, 1960s. And starting with the fact that they each believed in an ordered universe and the idea that there is a creator, and that from the mind of this creator we have the flow of history and the imperative for moral justice. One concern that they both shared was that the progress of society, and maybe there needs to be an asterisk on that term, but that the progress of society materially had sort of resulted in a hollowing out of sort of the deeper resources of the human soul on some level, that we were finding ourselves entering into an interconnected world through commerce and certainly the wealth produced by capitalism, but that to the extent to which our values were becoming values based in consumption, values based in the acquisition of material goods, both King and Kirk saw that as something of a threat to the deeper sort of reservoir of human fulfillment that could be found with finding our place essentially in God's design. Now, their politics were starkly opposite, and yet I saw them as both proceeding from this larger starting point and this sort of moral concern for the sort of sameness that was being foisted upon us by losing sight of our traditions and our spiritual connections in favor of just sort of consuming the kind of material wealth of the world. And I'm wondering if there's some degree to which your understanding of conservatism or conservative nationalism itself is, in part at least, a reaction to that phenomenon in
Sure.
history and certainly in modern life.
Well, look, I have not seen your speech, but if you send it to me, I will definitely look at it.
Yeah.
My inclination, just on the basis of what you've said now, is to think, yeah, you're onto something. I mean, I basically agree with everything you said. I think I think that what people often miss is that although King tilted left and Kirk tilted right, but both of them they're biblical thinkers.
Yeah.
Both of them are very concerned with the teachings, not just of Christian scripture generally, but especially of the Old Testament, which is, you don't always find that to say the least, in 20th century thinkers. So those intellectual and spiritual figures who remain connected to the American biblical inheritance, they sound very different from people who are talking, just about the rule of pure reason and the universal power of the human brain. It's a look. What can you say? Christianity is not liberalism. And both Christianity and Judaism, if taken seriously, they lead you to a very different anthropology, a different way of looking at human beings and human nature and what human potential is and what fulfills human beings. I'm completely with you on this.
Well, let me use that as the further doorway then into perhaps an even deeper part of this, which is that. And let me speak from my own vantage point here. I'm somebody who tends to, I think, lament the fact that, at least in my own estimation, I sort of see there as being a couple sort of largely predominating frameworks for moral understanding through which we operate in modern society. I see them as sort of competing and arm wrestling with each other, and yet each of them sort of leading us astray in some sense. On the one hand, I see sort of a utilitarian or consequentialist way of looking at the world, which I roughly sort of think of as a sort of a strain of what we get from the Enlightenment, where we, the embrace of pure reason, which says that we can tell a thing is good by virtue of its sort of material impacts and consequences. And if we, crunch the numbers and are able to sort of see where the GDP winds up, falling and this, that, or the other, if we can graduate enough folks from college, we know that a policy is good or a thing is good. And really, these are matters of calculations. Then on the other hand, and I'm being obviously very, very simplistic here. On the other hand, I see there as being a way of engaging tradition, which can strike me as sort of deontological or dogmatic, to be slightly pejorative, that we can say, well, this thing is right because, my grandparents' grandparents said it was right. This is my religion. This is my tradition. These are the rules of it. And I don't really need to look or pay attention to too much of anything else in the way of new information. I know if I have this allegiance and just stick to it, that everything is going to be well for me and sort of world be damned if there are any contrary points of evidence. I think that what I believe in is I do believe in the power of reason, and I also believe in the value of tradition. But I think what anchors me more deeply is a belief in virtue. The idea that there are components to the human character derived from essential truths of the human soul that you cannot, at least from my vantage point, you cannot fully appreciate without having some appreciation for man's relationship to God and how that expresses itself in tradition, but that also shines a light on, sort of the proper use of reason and how we can contextualize reason within a larger sort of understanding of the human soul and how it relates to some greater design. And so in arguing that there are some similarities between Dr. King and Russell Kirk, part of what I seized upon was this sort of idea that, to my mind, in some deep and meaningful way, both men were sort of virtue ethicists. I mean, Dr. King, the philosophy of nonviolence was rooted in this idea that agape love or goodwill, sort of a spiritual power that could affect social transformation, and that's expressed in the way we behave. That's expressed in sort of the character that we cultivate in ourselves, an unwillingness to think evilly about other people, even as we summon the courage to confront evil by speaking words of truth. And of course, conservatism, as Russell Kirk described it, is a cast of mind. Russell Kirk attributed conservative qualities to people as philosophically different as John Adams to John Randolph, people whose policies probably or Alexander Hamilton to John Randolph for that matter, people whose policies and political instincts were starkly different, but who embodied prudence, who embodied wisdom in different ways. It seems to me that virtue, that if we have some sense of what it means to embody traits like wisdom, like prudence, like goodwill and love and courage, that these things they can only really blossom out of the soil of an understanding of ancient truth and tradition, right? Because that's what cultivates it over time. That's how I see the sort of hand of God is tilling the soil over time. But that also sort of the fruits of that to me are reason rightly understood, the application of what we understand, the truths of life and history to be sort of applied, through prudence, through wisdom, with courage, with goodwill, to the actual living and evolving problems of the present moment. And so I fear for a world and a society in which we have ideological arguments that sort of pit reason and tradition, or let's say, maybe ideology and dogma sort of against each other, without them being anchored in the middle by an understanding of virtue, by a sense of, what the power points are within the human soul that allow us to make the best of both of these things. And I feel like in so much of our contemporary discourse, and not just contemporarily, but for a very long time now, we haven't had much of a language for virtue. We haven't had much of a discourse around virtue. And so we gravitate towards people who seem really smart on the one hand or really strong on the other hand in terms of political leaders and intellectuals and so forth. But we lose our capacity to fully realize ourselves as good men and women with a stronger sort of sense of what goes into that, right? Because we are gravitating towards smarts and formulas on the polls, but not living out the spiritual existence of cultivating ourselves in terms of developing our characters, right? And so that's kind of been my way of assessing kind of where we are, in modern society and what we're lacking in our moral conversation and how that detracts from the larger kind of political and social conversation. And so I offer that to you as a window into my own thinking with the following question. Do you have a particular thoughts about sort of, the need or lack thereof for a virtue ethos in our contemporary discourse, and whether one is a liberal or a conservative? Is there a space that may need to be widened for that area of contemplation that may serve some positive connecting function in between?
I'm inclined to agree. I mean, there's you're definitely right that dogmatic thinking, a rigid adherence to certain principles without paying much attention to the question of, what are the limits of these principles and how do we balance them against one another? That's an evil that exists. It exists on the left. It exists on the right. These days, I mean, I think we've in our generation, we've gotten to see that there's even such a thing as a centrist dogmatism.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
where people, you find it difficult to talk to people. I mean, they are sitting in the center of the political map, but they can also be fanatically, closed-minded about having compromise or balancing things.
The closed-minded center is a real thing.
To be sure, it's real.
Mm-hmm.
So, I certainly, my Orthodox Jewish tradition, its virtue, the virtues that it cherishes are slightly different than Christian virtues, and both of those are in a lot of ways very different from Aristotelian virtues, which are pagan virtues. I definitely agree that the search for virtue in education and in the way we lead our public life, it's absolutely dead center the way we want to be thinking about the kind of life that we're leading. I would just say that some of the academic virtue theorists seem to me to be not sufficiently aware of the fact that that pursuing virtue is not the same as knowing the substance of morality and justice. Those are not identical things. That they're related, but they're not identical. So, I mean, Aristotle is the number one virtue thinker that people are tend to quote. The problem is that Aristotle, of course, thought that a child who was born with a deformity or in some other way undesirable to his or her parents could just be left on a mountaintop to die of exposure. And it's only from the Bible that Jews and Christians get things like the value of the sanctity of every human life. That's not something you can get from the Greeks, and so I think we need both. I think we have to be very clear about what our biblical inheritance is and how it sets boundaries as to what's right and wrong. And the virtues, of course, are that's one of the central ways that we learn to be strong men and women fighting for what's right.
Indeed. I feel like I hear you loud and clear when you say that yours is a nationalism embracing of the sovereignty and independence of nations, and that furthermore, there's a danger to the interconnectedness, to sort of the hyper interconnectedness that has been facilitated by sort of the rush towards a global order politically, economically and commercially. I tend to look at even sort of much of the social justice movement, the modern social justice movement on the left, and you hear much in the way of people, particularly many people of color and so forth, sort of elevating a dialogue over let's honor our ancestors, let's sort of lean into sort of our cultural and ethnic sort of affinities, and that's worrisome to many liberals and sort of, I think, liberal conservatives, so to speak, alike, who feel that this is a rejection of sort of the kind of colorblind ethos of American liberalism. But I think one charitable way to look at that is to say that, well, I think that a lot of people, left and right, are somewhat rejecting of a homogenizing, even through multiculturalist orthodoxy, but a homogenizing, of their own identities in favor of some universalism, whereas what they also want, or what they want more, is to be in touch with their own lineages, their own traditions. And that doesn't necessarily have to mean hostility towards other groups. But I would pose a similar question to them, though, because we do live, certainly in the United States of America, more broadly, in a country, in a world where it just seems necessary to be able to interact with people who exist well outside of our own immediate lineages and traditions. What aids us in doing that? What can aid us in doing that? If you have to share a country, or if you have to share, institutional space or what have you, with somebody, who's a Marxist, who's an atheist potentially, somebody who is someone who's a Muslim and very much committed to that. I think my hope is lied in the idea that, on some level, and I hear what you say about the distinctions between Aristotelian virtue and Judeo-Christian virtue, and the distinction between, virtue in the Jewish and Christian context. I'm actually with you on all those points, although, we'll have another conversation, I hope, to where we can dig into some of those details a bit more. Nevertheless, I would like to think that truth ultimately is transcendent, ultimately, and that, somehow or other there are resources in the human spirit that can allow us to develop meaningful and profitable human connection, even across a fairly wide gulf in traditions. Maybe there's a limit to that, but I place some faith in the idea that, some of the raw virtues of goodwill, particularly the raw virtue of goodwill, can help us, forge some bonds and capacity for shared government and civic life across some of those divides. I'm wondering if there's anything that aids you in that project, or if that's something that you may find yourself to be a little less hopeful for at scale and in the long run.
Being able to get along with people in a given society with different kinds of people. I mean, it is a fundamental, it's a fundamental natural aim of politics. Right. I mean, every society has its dominant traditions, and every society has minorities. I mean, there's no such thing anywhere in history as an actually homogeneous nation. Every nation is internally diverse, and in fact, an awful lot of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, is about the problem of making how you get to peace and justice among competing tribes that are very different from one another. So this is it's an old problem.
Right.
One of the strong political and moral impulses that we get through Scripture is the idea that that the brothers killing Joseph is some kind of vast evil, or they're selling him to. They originally were talking about killing him, selling him to slavery is an extraordinary evil. That brothers, that the idea that the different groups within a nation are at some level brothers, that's also a biblical idea. But I don't want to be too naive about it, because the competition among the different tribes and parts of a nation, and when I say a nation, by the way, I mean like just like a family can adopt new members, or a tribe can adopt new families that are new. The same thing is true of nations. Nations are capable, and often do in history, adopt new tribal groups into the nation. That's not like a modern thing. That's right. Been going on in history forever. But I don't want to be too naive about this, because groups of human beings have the capacity to feel like they're honored and they're recognized and they're part of the coalition, and to be totally loyal to it, even if they're very different, and to be loyal to one another. That's possible. Another possibility is that a group, a smaller group, seems threatening to a larger group, and instead of finding an appropriate compromise that makes both sides happy, it leads to violence and to to hatred and to destruction. There is no formula for how to prevent that from happening. But it's very easy to be tolerant of a minority when that minority group is relatively small and weak and isn't threatening anything. And the larger and more cohesive the minority becomes, the more threatening it is to people in power, and it just gets harder and harder to be tolerant and just and to unify everybody. So, America is in a period right now of increasing tribalism, increasing tribal hatred. It's really, distrust between the different groups. It's gotten to the point where it seems like every election, doesn't matter who wins, there's somebody on the other side saying that it was rigged and it was stolen.
Yeah.
A country can't survive that way indefinitely. Either you can find a way to compromise on certain ground rules and to have a degree of mutual respect that mutual loyalty can be built on. Either that, or you'll end up with civil war and one side winning by force. So, look, for sure, our aim as Jews and Christians and heirs to the biblical tradition is to find a way to peaceably accommodate people who are very different from us. But I also think that there are limits to what is possible, and I want to be realistic about this. Sometimes when I'm talking to liberals, not to speak of Marxists, I mean, I feel like they're incredibly naive about. I mean, often they don't even recognize. They're not even willing to recognize that there is such a thing as human loyalty groups and competition among the different tribes. In some ways, it's easier to talk to Marxists because, they want to overthrow, the dominant tribe. But at least, sociologically, they're willing to admit that there is such a thing as competing tribes and the possibility of oppression. Whereas often liberals are not even willing to admit that exists. So that brings me back to your point about color blindness. That, you'll see it if you take a look at my books, that I'm super sympathetic to to the post World War II American impulse that this war was fought against German racism, and what are we doing persecuting blacks back home in our own country? We need to find a way to put an end to that. So, on the one hand, I'm super sympathetic to that. On the other hand, I'm not completely sure that colorblindness has resolved all of the issues the way it was supposed to. And one of the reasons that I say this is because, as a since I'm Jewish, I'm an Orthodox Jew, and I to me it's very, very clear the way that religious Jews have a common bond within the community, a common loyalty and tradition, kind of a fellow feeling, and also common interests. And when I get to have off-the-record conversations with representatives of the Black community, a lot of the time, what I feel like I'm hearing is very similar to what's familiar to me from religious Jews. We in the Black people will tell me, in the Black community, we have our own traditions, we have our own interests, and it's not enough that that I can get a job at Goldman Sachs competing against a white guy, because as a community, we also want to be respected and recognized for who we are without being forced to assimilate 100% into this kind of homogenous liberal world. And I'm not sure that liberals here that need as much as they should.
Yeah, well, I consider that to be an apt observation. And it's funny because for myself, I'm very much a product just in my own life of a multicultural liberalism. I come from, a racially and ethnically mixed household and family. I grew up in a multicultural sort of progressive community. I'm very at home in that kind of environment. And yet I think, however, in coming from a family where the different branches of my family extend into communities that are more rooted in their community identity, I think I also sort of experience that multicultural space as being one thing among other things, but not necessarily the universal thing that it sort of sees itself as, if that makes some sense. And I think that part of what we're reckoning with here is the fact that I think that there is something of a liberal center in mainstream American life. And when I say liberal center, I'm talking about Democrats and Republicans, self-styled liberals and conservatives who nevertheless sort of hold to this sort of essential formulation. And I think that they are surprised to find themselves under something of a two-pronged sort of, critique against some of those foundational assumptions from both the right and the left, essentially encapsulated in what it is you just articulated, your conversation with people in the Black community and finding that, even among, Black folks who are not just like left, but even radically so in many cases, that there is this sort of similar kind of response kind of against some of those formulations that have been so intrinsic to kind of the liberal mentality for so long. And of course, one thing, I don't know if you know this, but Jeff Nelson at the Russell Kirk Center, Russell Kirk's son-in-law, a good friend of mine, sort of turned me on to this. But Russell Kirk and Malcolm X met and had a conversation, had a brief, but apparently fairly impactful interaction with each other.
I was not aware of that. That's fascinating.
I will send you an article that Russell Kirk wrote, essentially eulogizing Malcolm X after he was assassinated. And obviously the differences between those two men, to say nothing of Kirk and King, but the difference between those two men and their politics was stark. And yet there are ways in which Kirk and Malcolm probably had more in common than even, Kirk and King might have had, or King and Malcolm for that matter. Because, Malcolm was a man who believed in nationhood in the tribal sense and so forth.
Right.
And sovereignty was something that mattered a great deal to Malcolm. And in any event, it's a little bit funny to me because there is, I think, a deep-seated human need for community, to be in touch with tradition, and I feel like we can only satiate that through sort of consumption and kind of the raw output of, our self-satisfaction with our own intellects and so forth for so long. But I think my hope would be that, I don't know, that we can establish a context in which we can communicate sort of civilly and amicably, across this sort of rather far-flung and disparate sort of political differences that exist between people who might also be in the grips of a similar sort of spiritual hunger in some sense in a political context, so that we can actually move things forward. And I guess a way of simplifying that would be simply to say that I would love to get to a point where, MAGA folks and BLM folks could actually see what they have in common, to put it sort of simply and sort of bluntly here. As big as the universe of differences are between them, and while also upholding that which is good, and I think that there's an awful lot that is good in that sort of traditional kind of liberal orientation, sort of in the center there. And so, in any event, I consider that to be something of the braverangels project, and maybe you and I can get a little deeper into that next time we have the good fortune to to jump on the line. Yoram Hazony, thank you so much for joining us on Uniting America.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to Uniting America. If you'd like to support the show, you can do it by subscribing on YouTube and on your favorite podcast platform and leaving us a positive rating, review, or suggestions. Follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and tune in for more content. And learn more about the movement to depolarize America at braverangels.org.